time. So I'm Jill Rutter, I'm a Senior Fellow at the Institute for Government, which is just down the road, extraordinarily conveniently, and I'm delighted to be chairing this session about the disinformation, the potential impact of disinformation on democracy. I'm going to first of all introduce my fantastic panel, who are going to kick us off with sort of roughly 5, maybe a bit more minutes each on their takes on the current situation, how that might evolve, the risks and potential benefits that we might see if we counter disinformation well. So on my extreme left is Kevin Armstrong. Kevin is Policy and External Relations Manager at Full Fact. If you don't know Full Fact is a fantastic fact-checking charity. She says, I should say that I used to be involved in Full Fact, and they used to occupy the upstairs of the Institute for Government building for a period. So we work very closely with Full Fact, and if you don't support them now, reconsider after you've heard Kevin's remarks, and definitely do. If you do support them, don't reconsider after hearing Kevin's remarks. And then on my immediate left, I have Dr. John, and I've made the mistake of not asking him how to pronounce his name, so I'm about to mangle that. Rosenbeek.
That's actually perfect.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay. Who is an affiliate lecturer in the Department of Psychology at the University of Cambridge and an assistant professor in psychology at King's College London. I hope both institutions know that, and you're not an example of people who are benefiting from working from home to hold down 2 jobs without telling their employers. But anyway, John is the author of 2 recent books with Cambridge University Press: The Psychology of Misinformation and Propaganda and Ideology in the Russian-Ukrainian War, and that's one of his specialities. So very, very interesting there. And finally, on my right, I have Dr. Anne-Christine Glenster, Deputy Director of the Minderoo Centre for Technology and Democracy at the University of Cambridge. And the centre is, I'm going to get this, it's a consortium of independent researchers who aim to bridge the gap between high-quality research and public policy. I think we're all very much in favour of that here, with a particular focus on information technology, higher education, and the public good. She's a legal expert on data protection, privacy, cybersecurity, and AI governance, and has advised, too long a list to go through, but she's advised absolutely anyone who matters in this space. So what we're going to do is kick off. First of all, we're going to go to Kevin first, but just to sort of set the scene slightly, disinformation abounds, growing. We're all aware of it. We all expect disinformation to be the big dog that barks in election campaigns. We might say, actually, it's slightly abounded a bit less than we might have expected in both the British and US elections last year, partly because both of those look slightly more like foregone conclusions, and maybe we didn't see what was happening because we weren't all accessing the darker parts of the web. But we know that this is a rising risk. We also know that certainly the UK government, and maybe other governments hear about this, and Christine, are a bit behind the curve in updating whether it's our electoral law or some of our regulations to try to deal with that. We also know there's more to be done in equipping ourselves to be aware of misinformation, disinformation, its risks. You'll explain to us what the difference is between disinformation and misinformation. The risks, what we can do to apply a bit more critical faculty. Only yesterday, David Lammy called out the new Reform MP for Runcorn, told her to get off social media and stop believing every conspiracy theory she saw. Maybe she needs to donate to Full Fact too. Whatever, we need to think about actually what can we do, both as individuals, but also in terms of government regulation and how we can regulate a sector where a lot of the operators are clandestine, a lot of the big companies operating in this space are not necessarily UK-based, and where we see a lot of pressure from the US government to stop European governments from interfering in what they may term free speech. So we're going to address all those issues. We're going to have short opening comments from our panel, and then we're going to get stuck in so all of you can comment, question, whatever, heartily disagree with the floor, and then we will finish up at 1 o'clock. So I'm going to kick off with Kevin. What do you think the current state of play is, and is it going to get worse? Is there any light at the end of the tunnel? Is there anything we can do other than write ginormous checks to Full Fact? Kevin.
Thanks very much, Jill. I guess you would expect a fact-checking organisation to tell it as it is.
I'd hope so. Otherwise we'll fact-check you.
So I will begin just as Full Fact did in its annual report recently, which is to say that we're in a moment of crisis for anyone who cares about verifiable facts. But don't worry, just like the speakers did earlier this morning, if you think you're about to face a barrage of negativity, I promise to finish on a more positive note. So for anyone who isn't already aware of Full Fact and what we do, we're the UK's independent fact-checking organisation. We use our AI tools and other methods to find, expose and counter the harm that bad information does. And thanks to funding, not as far as I'm aware, from Reform MPs or any other party, but certainly from the public, from trusts and others, we're able to check an array of claims, from hoax posts and fake retail offers on social media to miscaptioned footage of crises, as well as inaccurate claims made both by and about politicians. We're also currently able to rate content for moderation on some social media platforms, and unlike other fact-checking organisations, we intervene to get misinformation corrected, and we campaign to achieve wider improvements to the information environment and restore public trust. And here's the thing. Trust is worryingly low. Something is seriously wrong somewhere that must explain the low levels of trust in key public figures that polling shows. So, for example, Full Fact commissioned a poll by Ipsos last year, which showed that just over half of people surveyed said that they tend to ignore what parties and politicians say because they don't know if they can be trusted. But why? Well, one reason for the crisis I mentioned is that Parliament isn't doing enough to combat mis- and disinformation. I say this bravely, knowing that we have at least one former MP in the room. But I just want to offer 2 points on this. Firstly, from my perspective as someone who actively seeks corrections for Full Fact, I don't think politicians are doing enough to correct false and misleading claims. Over half of the non-ministerial MPs that we've contacted since the election have corrected claims when asked by us, and we thank them for doing so. But there's still significant scope for improvement. So, for example, when the Lancet, the BMA, the House of Commons Library, and many others recently corrected a health claim that we investigated, to date, 2 MPs have still failed to correct the record. Ministers are even more of a concern. Despite the change in government, we've continued to see ministers fail to correct the record on most occasions when asked by us. Since the election, just 2 corrections have been made by ministers out of 22 requests that we've made. So the second point about politicians is that I think they can help to restore trust by taking policy action that shows that they really care about it. They've done this, to their credit, just last year by improving the correction system in the Commons following a campaign by Full Fact, but there's significant scope for further improvement. I should add, a party elected on the promise to introduce an Ethics and Integrity Commission to ensure probity in government, as its manifesto said, should deliver it. And a party that initiates a welcome review of the curriculum should build on this progress and ensure that media literacy is a skill that everyone has, regardless of their age or socioeconomic background. But another reason for the crisis that I mentioned at the beginning is online platforms. Online platforms are a key reason why media literacy is needed, but there's more I should say on this. Firstly, it's that Meta has already ended its third-party fact-checking program in the US, and it may do so here and elsewhere. As one of the organizations that's part of this program, we genuinely don't know yet what's going to happen, and some fact-checking organizations may not survive. If online platforms are to rely on community notes as an alternative, we need to know how issues encountered with community notes so far, such as the need for consensus where there is none, will be overcome. And as we said in our annual report, we need the government to demand clarity from online platforms. how will they counter misinformation? What data will they share to ensure that the public still gets timely, accurate information? So I promised you positives, and it would be pretty bad if a fact checker made a misleading statement, so I will deliver on it. I think we can get out of this crisis if, for example, more politicians do correct their claims. At Full Fact, recently we've been upping the consequences of not correcting and the benefits of correcting, and that is seeing a movement in the direction we'd like to see. So there's one positive. Another is that I think relevant legislation can be strengthened. There are opportunities with both the Online Safety Act and the Elections Bill, and we're working on that. And then lastly, I've already covered this a bit, but online platforms can take greater responsibility for media literacy initiatives, and we're looking at that too. So I'm really looking forward to hearing your thoughts on those as well as other ideas, and I'm grateful for CSaP for having me and others here today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kevin. That was very, very interesting. We'll try some of your ideas on the rest of the panel and on our audience. But John, let's come to you now about more of the psychology of all of this, which is really quite interesting. Why are we so gullible? Are we so gullible?
I would honestly say not that gullible, in the sense that what the producers of mis and disinformation don't really fundamentally rely on is the assumption that we give you a falsehood and you believe it. Right? That's not really how it happens. What happens is false beliefs form over time and with increased, sort of more intense exposure. Right? So this ends up happening, for example, in echo chambers on social media, but also in environments where exposure to misinformation is more common. Right? And this isn't an immediate process. This takes place over longer time spans, which complicates matters greatly, because it means that we cannot, for instance, focus exclusively on this true-false distinction, which a lot of the research in my field unfortunately does, where we know, for example, that like disinformation produced by states or by corporate actors, tobacco industry, etc., right? They try to avoid, where possible, like outright falsifiable lies. Why? They're basically because fact-checking works in that context, right? Because you're doing great work and you can debunk it, and if there is no excuse, then, meaning it was an outright lie, we know it was a lie, then you can remove it to some extent, or you can downrank it without real serious consequences or disagreement, right? Because it was just a lie. So you try to find ways around that. And the way to do that is by not really focusing on, I want you to believe something that isn't true, but rather I want you to be confused about where the truth even is. Or I want you to sort of throw your hands in the air and say, I have no idea, right, what to even believe here. Or, and that's a very critical one, I don't really care about your belief system very much, but I care very much about how extreme it is. Right? And so therefore, right, like this disinformation, what I'm now talking about, kind of deliberate production of this type of content, isn't ideological at all. It is strategic. Right? And so in the 80s, let's say, when the Soviet Union was still a thing, you would see the majority of the efforts by the Soviet Union to kind of do opinion formation, opinion shaping in Europe to be focused towards left-wing groups. Now that's no longer the case. Now it's the populist right. Why is that? Have they shifted their belief system from left-wing to right-wing? Of course not. It's just the perceived strategic benefit of targeting populist right-wing politicians and influencers is greater at the moment than targeting left-wing or socialist or communist adjacent groups. Right? But this isn't stable over time. This shifts as kind of the perceived ideological benefits or payoffs shift. Right? So that's one point. And then the second point that I want to make, because I only have a few minutes, is under the assumption that there is a strategy happening, and this is a reasonable assumption because we know that state actors, Russia and China are big ones, but also Iran and also Israel, and also to an extent the United States, which is perceived as an ally, still is, right, invest substantial sums into the environment, the information environment in which we all consume information, right? But that isn't just social media, that is also mainstream media channels and, very importantly, influences. So what happens anecdotally, although we don't have good research on this at scale that kind of really maps out the problem, is we know that influencers on Instagram or on TikTok or other social media outlets who are posting certain types of like political or politically adjacent content anyway are approached by someone in their DMs, their direct messages, to say, hey, we'll pay you more money if you want to start posting this at a certain frequency. Right? Or we want you to focus on, immigration. We don't really care what your memes or your content is about, but we want you to post about immigration because they already know this person has a certain persuasion, they have a certain opinion about immigration, let's say, right? It can be other topics as well, but just using this as an example. And so they want to kind of increase the volume of the content that is produced, right? But at the same time, they don't want to have to rely on creating their own sources and building their own legitimacy. They're borrowing the legitimacy from people who already have a following online. And this happens in the social media influencer sphere. This happens in the mainstream media-ish kind of sphere, right, where we have Russia Today operating, for example, in Europe, no longer so much in the United Kingdom, but because of Ofcom stepped in, right? But also the Voice of Europe, which was a fairly big outlet that the Czech Secret Service found out was directly funded by the Kremlin. They shut it down, right? My point here, to summarize, is there's a whole kind of economy, right, that underlies all of these efforts to manipulate people online. And we don't understand this economy very well. So we really need to invest substantial time and research into understanding the digital manipulation economy. So, thank you.
Okay, brilliant. Very, very short and snappy. Thank you very much, John.
5 minutes.
Lots more time to come back to. Don't worry, don't worry. So we've almost, Anne, Kristin, had the sort of micro problems with individual claims and people not taking necessarily the right action to make sure that people can be confident that our politics is operating in a high-trust environment, to a sort of more macro environmental thing where bad actors, can we call them bad actors, or malign actors are deliberately going out to just confuse people. So there seem to be multiple targets, multiple sort of potential ways in which we can intervene to deal with this. So what can the law do anything? Can regulation do anything? What else are our policy options in this space?
Huge question. I will try to be snappy as well. We'll see if I succeed. I want to make 3 points, and very quickly. First of all, I recognize exactly the world that the previous 2 speakers have spoken about. And full fact, I know the work, I've read the report, it's stellar work, it's extremely depressing. So with that, I want to make the first point, what's the state of play? We have certain attempts at regulation for this. We know the Online Safety Act, we know in Europe there's the Digital Services Act, there is, which is being strengthened through the European Democracy Action Plan and the code, I think, of disinformation that they're now trying to shift from voluntary, for example. The US, there have been attempts, there are certain pockets of things, but I'll come back to the US, we know that's turbulent. So, the first point to say, yes, we have attempts at regulation. It has so far, from my point of view, failed. And it has failed for a few structural reasons. Number one, and I'll come back to this in terms of are there other ways to do solutions. They come from the idea of protecting consumers. And I'm talking about the logic of the law. And so with that, the first thing they run into is freedom of speech. You know, we should also let people have autonomy and so on and be exposed to ideas. So we do not want to censor things online. The Online Safety Act, we'll remember, a lot of the debate about that was about where that line and threshold should lie. And then it runs into the other issues that we have with all sort of tech regulation law. Number one, jurisdiction. We can only enforce in our own jurisdiction. So much of this is global. Number two, the pace of technology. So this idea of the pacing problem, the law always lags behind. Whether or not that is true is disputed, but this is the sort of perennial tension we're struggling with. Number three, enforcement. It doesn't matter if we have a law if we can't enforce it. And enforcement means we need resources, we need expertise, we need a political willingness even And by that, for example, the European Commission can say they're going to impose fines, but if they feel pressure from the American companies for other reasons, they won't. So, and the technical standards for enforcement tend to change. So if you start to look at all of these regulations, on page like 240, they will start to talk about the technical, how this is technically going to be done, and then you see that tech companies have all these sort of reasonable efforts, or they get to set the standards themselves, or they will not let auditors look at their data and systems and so on. So very hard to make this work. I like all of Kevin's ideas. I will try to expand on that, maybe throw some other ingredients in at the end. But that's where we are. But there are also a couple of new things. Number one, technologically, the big change there, generative AI. Deep fakes, voice cloning, all of this means that it's now easier than before to create misinformation, disinformation, misleading information, malinformation, what have you. And we're flooded by it. And we're flooded by it not always with strategic or political intent. A lot of it is. But a lot of it is just people playing around. Right? But to focus our minds, we have all seen the picture of Trump dressed as the Pope. This is a typical example. My personal view on this is not because Trump thought any of us would believe it, but it's setting the stage for this kind of content to come down the pipeline, and it makes it normalized, and we accept this kind of imagery. As John said, it builds over time. Right? So this we can see. Second, geopolitically, things changed last year with the Trump administration. We cannot ignore that either. And I think there was a watershed moment for me exactly when Meta pulled out of fact-checking and started to talk about community notices. Now, the reason why this is problematic is because the Trump administration, in my view, as a scientist, is on an anti-scientific mission. So therefore, there's an attack on, for example, research and academic institutions. And what that means is, to me, an attack on scientific method, empirical evidence, and the idea of what we as a society consider to be true. So everything becomes relevant, everything becomes an opinion. And if that happens, we end up in what Shoshana Zuboff at Harvard talks about as epistemic chaos. I don't think we're at that point. I think we are, though, approaching potentially what I would call an epistemic crisis. And that takes me to my solution point, possibly, if there is one. I don't think we should give up. I think we should do what Kevin said. We should hold our politicians to account. We should hold tech companies more to account, and so on. That said, one of the things we're trying to do at Harvard is come at this from a slightly different angle. So I am in addition to being at the University of Cambridge, I'm also a Technology and Human Rights Fellow at the Harvard Carr Ryan Center for Human Rights Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. And there we are talking about trying to develop a concept for epistemic rights based on the human rights we already have that relates to our mental faculties. And that means the right to mental privacy, the right to freedom of thought, the right to conscience, belief, and so on, but also a right to the access for information that leads to education, that leads to a true public sphere, or public sphere done with truth. And I say that as an interesting angle. We don't know if this is going to play out. It may not. But if we go through that route, we might have new opportunities through international human rights law. And I see it as a potential to revive some of the international cooperation that has fallen to the wayside. So that is what I'm going to be working on the next year. That, again, to finish up, shouldn't undermine any of the important work that's already in the pipeline, but hopefully it can be an addition.
Very interesting. Kevin, John, any comments on the sort of solutions that Anne-Christine's come, particularly this idea that I've never heard of before about using international human rights law, which doesn't always have the best of names at the moment in political circles, perhaps? But
I mean, I'm thinking about the politics of this with a few months ago, J.D. Vance sort of talking about dangers to freedom of speech in these shores, and also like the political interests such as the Conservative Party's like work at the moment, looking at the relevant rights. So I'm just trying to sort of think that through and think how things could play out in taking a human rights approach on it, and the risk of a backlash against it that could actually inadvertently harm efforts to improve the information environment. But I think it's a very interesting idea.
John, any thoughts?
Yeah, very interesting idea for sure. I think it makes sense, I think, to approach the way that we consume information in the modern day from the perspective of epistemology, basically, right? Or epistemology? How is it pronounced? I don't know. My English goes up and down depending on the day. Epistemology, I'm fairly sure. Because if we're talking about rights, right, what do I feel I have a right to when I go online, right? I've already kind of abandoned this feeling that I had a right to privacy, that I have the right that no one knows who I am if I don't want them to know who I am. Right? I used to feel this way when I was, in my early 20s, and I was sort of naive, perhaps, right? That there would be a pathway to get companies to agree to voluntarily just not use any data that I give them, right? But there are definitely discussions to be had around that, right? Like epistemically speaking, like what am I entitled to as a user of commercial products, effectively, that are so universally adopted that we cannot really do without them anymore. Conversely, right, what are the responsibilities that I expect from those entities that impose these conditions on me to a certain degree, right? And I feel that one of the kind of most productive pathways that I've been thinking about is I still feel that I have the right to be lied to, in a sense, right? And I still, like, and I guess, like, from a practical perspective, especially in the United States, the right to lie is kind of sacrosanct. And we might not like it, but there's also not much that can really be done about that. Right? But I do feel quite strongly that I have the right to authenticity, that at the very least I want to know if I'm talking to a bot. Right? And that is a right that I quite strongly feel I have, right? If I'm on Reddit, let's say, right, where like it's bot post after bot post after bot post. It is absolutely absurd, right? And it's very recognizable depending on where what forum you're in, right? Because it's very formulaic content. You can spot them as being generated by ChatGPT, right? There is an offense that is caused in me by no one telling me that this is a bot, that I have to figure this out for myself, right? Even though, like, Reddit has, I can detect that it's a bot, and so can Reddit, presumably, right, to an extent. Why are they not telling me this, right? And so there, right, the right to authenticity, perhaps. And that doesn't mean that I should be exposed to no inauthentic content whatsoever, right? It's more like, it'd be nice if they actually let me know, right, that this was not genuinely created by a real person expressing their own opinions, but by some probability this was a bot. I think that pathway is reasonable also because I feel the discussion about kind of truths versus falsehoods versus the benefits of political lying, right, as described by Jonathan Swift 300 years ago or thereabouts, right? That is now becoming so kind of politically entrenched, as you mentioned, with J.D. Vance just coming over to Europe and telling us that we are censoring people, right? This discussion isn't very productive at the moment. And so that means that the pathways out of it, which we do need, are perhaps sort of along the avenue of kind of authenticity. I'm positing this. I'm not saying that this is true. I'm just making an argument, I suppose.
So it's quite interesting because normally you would expect that if I have a choice between a social media channel that is supplying me lots of duff information and is bot-ridden, so I'm just being bombarded by bots, there might be a sort of place in the market for a social media channel that was a bit less bot-ridden, actually made a virtue of the fact that you were only talking to real people. And, you know, as at one point the platforms were doing a bit ago, I mean, you know, Full Fact worked quite a lot with Google and with whatever, they were seeing actually that this was in their business interests to say we're actually on verification and stuff like that. Do we see any possibility that actually, not the sort of bad actor, sort of deliberate state-driven disinformation, but that actually sort of, people will come to value channels more where information is reliable? We still see the BBC as a sort of trusted source, relatively trusted source for news, but equally things like BBC Verify become quite contested among politicians who say they don't like the sort of, fact-checking that the BBC indulges in. Kevin, do you think there's any chance that, the better will drive out just because it's a bad business model to be serving up bot-ridden duff information?
I mean, I think there's a lot going on. Yeah, I was really sort of drawn to an article I saw on the BBC website last week about more Americans now finding news from social media than more traditional news sources. But at the same time, their level of trust in that online information was very mixed. So it's almost like like John was saying, if society wants to have the right to be lied to, that they're happy to consume information that they don't think is reliable if they find it fun or entertaining. So bots can sort of play a role in driving that, and I think I remember at a CSaP event I was at last year hearing that during the pandemic there was actually an increase in traffic to the more established news websites for information about COVID-19, etc. But I think there is a danger that as distrust grows, if it does, then people are going to stop trusting those traditionally trusted sources of information as well. And then where do they go when they actually need the reliable information? I think, not trying to take us back into the sense of peril, but that's what we've really got to be mindful of and make sure that when people choose to, they can get the information that they really need.
And one of the things that mentioned was media literacy and who should be responsible for media literacy. Should it be in the school curriculum? Should we put an obligation on the tech companies to do that? What might that look like? Or are they too compromised? Would nobody trust their media literacy programs? And does media literacy actually work? I mean, is it an effective way of getting people? And Christine, what would you do about media literacy?
I was going to say, who knows? In terms of media literacy, it's something that everyone agrees we need. And we talk now about media literacy, we talk about AI literacy. And we talk about it, yes, in schools, yes, in workplaces, yes, everywhere. But we also need to think about what does that actually mean in terms of, I don't need to be a tech expert. That doesn't help me make any decisions. And also, people are very often already experiencing fatigue and reform fatigue and new changes fatigue and so on and so forth. So the idea that people can constantly take on new information is perhaps overambitious. Final point of that, and I just have two remarks. We also need to be extremely careful about burdening the individual with responsibility for making decisions, no matter how literate they are, for things that they can't be responsible for in the ecosystem, because then we are just outsourcing responsibility to individuals. And particularly, this becomes difficult as we're also all vulnerable. I mean, the way that emotional recognition software is now used in profiling, for example, to manipulate us online and so on. So I think we need to be careful. The two things, though, that sprang to mind as the other speakers were talking was John's note about the digital manipulation economy. I thought that was really interesting. And the first thing to think about is so much of this is about transparency. And so I sit in a lot of conversations where we talk about what is transparency, data provenance, sources for data, and so on, which goes to this point about it's not about whether or not you're lied to, but who does the lying and why, perhaps. And much of the generative AI and copyright debate is about that, for example, which has to do with can we have rights to attribution and so on. And then you said something about the idea of talking to bots. And do we have right to talk to human beings, or should we just be subjected to bots? And I do think those two things hang together. Because when it comes to the digital manipulation economy, what we're also seeing is the divide, the equality and equity divide between those who have money, who can pay for human interactions, who can pay for quality data, who can pay for source disclosure, and then those who don't. So I think we need to be careful also about this in terms of the regulation and the rules we set in place, how they will affect certain communities.
Loads and loads of issues coming out here. So let's go to the room. I think there is a roving mic. So very happy to take comments, not too long. So don't have the 5-10 minutes or whatever the panelists had. But quick comments and questions to the panel. So let's take them in sort of groups, because I think there'll probably be quite a lot. Yes, in the front. And tell us who you are.
Hello, I'm Tabitha Goldstorp, and I'm also on the board of Luminate, an organisation that funds civil society organisations to try and hold big tech accountable. And I'm really intrigued as to who should be funding this fight. We ourselves find it a challenge to encourage other funders to fund all of the different things that you're talking about. And I am the most concerned when it comes to your point around whether we're in crisis or chaos yet. It feels like the money is running away from the fight and not to it. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. And actually, probably everybody in the room's thoughts on that, if you'd like to find me later.
Okay, brilliant. And then the lady there in the green.
Hi there, thanks. I'm Marie Southgate, I'm Prison Policy Director in MOJ. I've got a couple of questions, if that's okay. So Jill asked the question earlier, are we just gullible? And I wondered whether you had reflections on whether we're more gullible when mis or disinformation sort of entrenches our own personally held political beliefs, and how we might sort of go about shifting when our sort of hearts and minds entangle with each other as a result of misinformation. And then my second question, so John, you made a really interesting point about the sort of disinformation economy. I wondered whether in the regulatory space, and Kristen, whether there's a sort of principle of following the money and thinking about, how can we, hold businesses or kind of economic actors to account where they are making transactions, I suppose, between a platform and an influencer in a sort of traditional way that we might have done in advertising last century, I suppose, between broadcasters and publishers. Is there some sort of regulatory merit in going after the money? Thank you.
Do you actually work in this area? Yeah. Oh, sure. Anyway, yes, I think there's one more. Yeah, it's one more and then we'll take these.
Ned Want, Department of Energy Security, Net Zero. I work on EU climate things, and it's a sort of EU-based question, I suppose. So do you think that we're particularly vulnerable to certain kinds of dis and misinformation? And sometimes we think of kind of targeted propaganda, other times we think of flooding the zone. Are there things that we should be looking out for in the UK?
Very interesting. Well, let's start with Tabitha's question. So who should fund this? Kevin, who should be funding this fight? I mean, we know that the government is very pressed for cash at the moment, potentially getting more pressed for cash with all those signatures on the welfare bill revolt that we've just seen. So can we do it? Can we, force levies on the tech companies? We've tried that as a thing. We know that doesn't go down terribly well with the current US administration. It sees it as a hostile act. So, how do we get enough money for all of this? Because polluter pays is usually quite a good principle.
Well, I mean, maybe if I focus on the funding of fact-checking organisations, Full Fact has a very clear fundraising policy where we don't receive a especially large proportion of funding from any one source. And we do that in part to hopefully provide assurance to the public about our impartiality and that there's no undue influence. That being said, as I've mentioned, we are still currently receiving some funding from Meta, amongst others. And we would sincerely hope that a way can be found for that to continue, because the work of fact-checking does cost money, and we think that what we do helps the online platforms to ensure that their users are having a positive experience. And I don't know what the future of engagement on online platforms would be if people just feel that it's a load of rubbish on there and nothing else. But I think we've taken a little bit more of a sort of subtle approach rather than just sort of putting our hands out for money, and we've recommended, for example, that the Online Safety Act be strengthened so that online platforms sort of extend their risk assessments beyond illegal content, and hopefully sort of reflect on what they really should responsibly be doing to ensure a safe experience for the public. And I'd hope that that would then lead to appropriate funding for us and other organisations that are under threat.
And John, the sort of things you were talking about to sort of generate politically motivated strategic confusion, which I'm going to use as a concept, does that fall to people like in the UK, the National Cybersecurity Centre, or who should be countering this? Because that seems to be a sort of different level of threat in some ways. That's part of your should be part of your defence strategy rather than.
Yeah. So, I think the FCDO has been talking about economic deterrence, effectively, in the cyberspace, right? So that seems to be a big thing that they are working on, which is to say, you want to disincentivize these types of manipulation from occurring in your country, right? How can you do that? Well, we have this one paper under review at the moment where we're tracking sort of day by day for every platform the cost of registering fake accounts, basically, which is only one component, right? Because it doesn't include all these influencers and so on that are like real people. But if you want to register a bot army, let's say if you want to create a bot army that spreads whatever content about cryptocurrencies or other scams or whatever they might be, then you need to register these accounts in the UK, preferably. Otherwise, they get caught and they get kind of deleted by the platform, etc. And so we're tracking the price of that. And what we find is that actually that price, sort of across countries, is predicted quite well by the price of SIM cards in a given country. It's very interesting. So what effectively is happening here, it seems to be, although again, this is early stages, we don't know a whole lot about this yet, is in a lot of countries, right, like there are these sort of SIM farms almost, where people buy up SIM cards in bulk and offer them on the market kind of to be used for account registrations. Why physical SIM cards and not virtual SIM cards? Physical SIM cards are much more successful because they're much less likely to be caught by the platforms as being the result of an inauthentic registration, right? And so that means that the higher the price of a SIM card in a given country, the higher the price also for fake account registrations. And by extension, we assume, although we want to test this, the costs of engaging in these types of manipulation, of building a bot army and doing influence operations and that kind of stuff, which is a fascinating insight, right? So that means that there's a couple of things you can do. You can try, for example, to make SIM cards more expensive, because what we find is that in countries like Australia, Japan, Malta, and Turkey, which are the 4 most expensive countries for this type of digital manipulation, it's really hard to buy a SIM card. Because in Australia, you need to show proof of ID to buy a SIM card. In Japan, you need to show proof of residency to buy one. In Turkey, you need the price is not that high, of a SIM card, but it is linked to your passport, from my understanding, right? And so here in the UK, they give you a free SIM card with your student loan package, more or less, right? Like they give them away for free. That means it's also really easy to buy them in bulk. Does it mean that therefore we now need a new rule that makes SIM cards super expensive? No, I'm not saying that. What I am saying is that is a possibility that we can explore. That is a practical avenue for specifically targeting the inauthentic component, which extends not only to disinformation, but also scams, et cetera, et cetera. So this is, again, we're not there yet. We don't know enough, but that's kind of the direction that we're headed in at the moment.
That's really interesting, because I thought cheap SIM cards were an unallied public good, I have to say, because they sort of, make it much easier for people to have access and stuff like that. And, I'm always very pleased with my mobile phone contract gets cheaper and cheaper, so it's me being very naive, but maybe you can have the sort of proof of ID without having to hike the price, but it'd be very interesting to see whether that was publicly acceptable. And Christine, any thoughts about who should fund this? And yeah.
Well, this is a very difficult one. I have very little to say on the money part, except to say it's extremely difficult. The funders, we know it's getting harder and harder. The money's running away. We also have a question about should this be for the private sort of philanthropic goodwill of some rich people to fix, or should it be something we as a society come together and fix? Could there be various ways to get together as a licensing fee or other things? These things have been mooted, and then the thing that sort of makes this very difficult, the only thing I can say about it, is the amount of lobbying money that goes against any of these attempts. And so far we're running up against that wall.
And what about the point from our colleague from MOJ here about sort of, is there scope for following the money? Is that a way of detecting bad actors and holding them to account, or is that just too difficult?
Too difficult.
Too difficult. Okay, sorry about that. Let's go to the... Sorry about that. It was quick. Does anyone disagree? No. What about this sort of, gullibility? It's quite interesting. We did some work at the Institute for Government, the Behavioural Insights team, and we, one of the sort of big things well documented in the behavioural literature is confirmation bias. And when we presented this report to the Permanent Secretary's Wednesday morning meeting, any Permanent Secretaries in the room, the bit that really resonated with the Permanent Secretaries most was that, the brighter people are incredibly good at rationalising out any conflicting information and just basically prizing information that confirms their existing bias. Is there anything we can do about that? Is that part of media literacy, to say be very suspicious of anything where you have a sort of prior, or do we just have to think, that's human nature, we've got to work with that? John, you're a psychologist.
I've worked a lot on what you might charitably describe as media literacy work on gamification, and I've also worked with Google to implement short sort of media literacy videos on YouTube. And it was specifically aimed at this, right? And not really kind of increasing our understanding of what's true or false, but rather like, can we identify the ways in which people seek to kind of persuade you or mislead you or manipulate you, right? So the underlying strategies, which might include fallacies, formal or informal, the use of emotion, how does a conspiracy theory work, et cetera, et cetera. Has that been successful? I would say I think there's great value in literacy, but the way for it to be successful is not a one-off kind of short video implemented as an ad on YouTube, because there is simply too much going on in the person's day for that to meaningfully contribute to changes in behavior or a sustained kind of attitudinal change over time, which is kind of what you try to achieve, one of those two, right? People stop sharing this information, let's say, or they update their attitudes with respect to how they consume content kind of permanently. For that, a video ad campaign is not enough, right? Because we know this from marketing research, like that, those effects are tiny. I do think that there's tremendous value to literacy, but it works in roughly the same way as like actual literacy, meaning like learning to read, right? Meaning today more people can read than could 100 years ago, and that's a great thing. But the result that came about not as a result of like, well, here's the alphabet, good luck, right? This was the result of a sustained effort on the part of government, right? Investing in education, making education mandatory up to a certain age, but also tremendous demand, right? It was really good for people to know how to read, because you can participate in society, you become a lot richer, et cetera, and also all the other cultural elements. It's nice to read a book. So here, like with media literacy, I think it works the same way, roughly speaking. There's definitely a theoretical pathway to boosting literacy at the population level that is very, very, very beneficial. But kind of the short-acting, kind of quick-fix interventions that we implicitly kind of rely on quite a lot, in isolation don't do much, although I can't speak as to whether in combination sort of the collective effort of all of these types of interventions may very well be effective. It's just that we have no way of measuring media literacy at the population level over time. So then we can't say much, unfortunately, under the data.
So, Kevin, you mentioned the curriculum review that Becky Francis is doing for Bridget Phillipson, that you want to see something about media literacy in that before they reject it, as we can't overburden the curriculum. What would you actually like to see? What would it look like in the curriculum? Is there a sort of something that you can say?
So to an extent, I'd need to defer to the detail in like the full fact report where we look at, for example, models in Finland that appear to have been quite successful early on. But in summary, I think it needs to be something that serves not just young people going through education, but also adults. I don't think it works to do one and not the other, and it needs to be dynamic. I'd look, for example, at a fact check that we did during the wildfires in America most recently, and there was a grok deep fake image of the Hollywood sign on fire, which was quite a convincing image. People might know that grok provides like a watermark for AI images, but in a lot of instances, including the one that we fact checked about, it had been cropped out, and you had to do a reverse image search to actually find out that where the watermark was. These are important skills that are needing to evolve very quickly in response to sort of improving technologies and so on. So I think there are resources on Full Fact's website about how to do this sort of stuff. We keep that updated, but anything in the curriculum needs to be future-proofed in that regard as well.
And what about the final question we had about, the sort of emerging, are we vulnerable? Are we seeing changes in the kinds of targeted disinformation? Kevin, go along the whole panel.
Yeah, it made me think of what some of the fact checks we published that have had the most traffic recently, and one that springs to mind is a fact check on claims about the gender of Brigitte Macron. And compare that to other fact checks that we've published about the gender health gap, a potentially misleading claim by the pensions minister about the cost of the triple lock during this parliament. Things that I think we would probably all agree are really important, but don't attract as much traffic. But maybe that's something we can embrace, and certainly that's what we try to do at Full Fact, is make sure that we build interest from the Macron check and help to inform and educate on other matters as well.
John, what do you think?
I think the hypothesis that Molly Crockett at Princeton, or one of the two, puts forward about moral outrage is quite good, which is the misinformation that we see kind of taps into kind of trying to evoke moral outrage about a given topic, right? And so it so happens that those topics for which that's most successful in our present time have to do with immigration, crime, gender, protecting the children, meaning pedophilia, basically, right? And so those are topics where what you're trying to achieve, whether by lying or not, to get people to be morally outraged about a particular issue, because the hypothesis is that those sentiments are very predictive, more so than kind of sentiments about kind of finance or inequality and those types of injustices, let's say, are much more likely to get people so riled up that they, I don't know, are more likely to vote for a party that promises to fix those things or go out and protest, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the moral outrage hypothesis, if you will. And I think that's attractive enough to take seriously and test properly, which Molly Crockett has done. So there's some good evidence for that as well.
And Christine, any thoughts about any particular sort of emerging trends in disinformation?
I think I've said the ones that I'm looking at, particularly related to generative AI. But I think that what all of this comes to is a huge issue also about trust, public trust, and trust with each other. And I was thinking about what you said about media literacy. I think it's also education literacy, and what does this do in terms of what do we trust, which is a dimension of it I don't think we've spoken enough about. Yeah.
Okay, let's have a few more questions. Julian at the front. Got a question there. So, Julian, then.
I'm Julian Huppard. I'm a recovering politician and various other things. I'm also a director of the Joseph Rowntree Reform Trust, and we're a very long-established non-charitable funder, mostly here in the UK. And because we're non-charitable, we can do bitey funding. We can fund essentially anybody to do anything. We're currently finalising a new strategy which will include more work on mis and disinformation. And I agree with what Tabitha was saying about money in this area. But I think there's also a question of who can get the funding in this area. And there's been some interesting ideas, new perspectives here. But I'm still not sure I have a clear picture of if this were funded, that would change. So I would love to hear a bit, other than your own organisations, your own research, if you weren't bound by any charity laws or anything like that, what are the things that would make a massive difference? So we put millions over the last few years into democratic resilience. There's an election bill come up we've been involved in. We've got almost 1 million people registered to vote. We're interested in doing things at that sort of scale. What would it be? And then can I also just give a very quick plug for the work Elizabeth Seeger's starting at Demos, so if you know about that already. That's one of the better things. There's an epistemic defence network, which I hope they'll get a better name for. Do you think that's a good option? What else would we need to see?
Okay, very good question. Let's go, I think the gentleman there.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Friso Graaf. I'm a PhD student at Queen Mary University. Just sort of building up on what Julian was saying and the other questions about sort of who pays for this. I'm thinking back sort of in the past, like a lot of our information was paid for by the public in sort of traditional media outlets. And on the internet, where we expect our information to be free, that model doesn't seem to work anymore. And I'm wondering, do you see a way in which traditional outlets, non-state outlets, can have an economic viability going into the future, and that model can be replicated in another form?
Okay, yeah, and let's go. I'm doing this. So let's go to Graham. Oh. It's not just people
Graham Pendlebury, formerly of the Department for Transport. I'm a bit more of a sceptic on this subject, and disinformation has been around for millennia, and it gets turbocharged now and again as some new technology comes along. And I certainly in my career had jobs where disinformation was quite common. I just wonder whether the current concern about disinformation is just another moral panic. And there's a kind of a knee-jerk reaction to say we must legislate, we must do something to control this, to stop it, etc. And there's a bit of a craze at the moment for using human rights concepts. So we'll give rivers and trees and mountains legal personality. And we're now thinking about apparently having some kind of epistemic rights. I wasn't quite sure I fully understood that. But the problem with it is I wonder whether that is actually as dangerous as the problem it's trying to solve, that we're creating an ever more legalistic kind of tangled thing as we're chasing after problems and strangling ourselves in more and more kind of legal knots. And linked to that, my final point would be that there seems to me to be also a risk that by trying to close down disinformation or tackle it, we also close down unwelcome or inconvenient information that may be true. And this is something that Baroness Casey talked about in her recent report on the grooming gangs things, where data is not collected, inconvenient facts are rather pushed to one side. Don't know whether the panel had any comments on that.
Good challenge. Let's take the first sort of couple of questions around sort of what should people do? What would good look like? How do we sort of pay? Start paying for information? Do we have to pay for information better? But what would good look like, and who should do it? I mean, is this like a ginormous Ofcom? Is that what we need, or is that a hopeless way of doing it, or quite what? Kevin, in your ideal world, what does a sort of well-funded battle against this look like? And not just a ginormous full fact.
I mean, I could repeat my earlier answer on this, and I won't. But I think on the idea of sort of state funding, I can imagine there would be sort of considerable discomfort with that idea, and concerns about sort of government interference, that separation between governments and those who do check what they are saying seems like quite an important one to me, unless there are lots of protections in place. And I'm interested sort of noted the point about how to avoid sort of inconvenient facts being taken down that are actually true. This is why good fact-checking costs money. It's about being sufficiently thorough to protect against exactly what you've described, and that's why it's so important that it does get the funding it needs. And I'd also,
you can only establish things as facts if people actually collect the data. And isn't that the prior question, that if you refuse to ask it, it's like, you can't get any diversity stats out of the European Commission because they follow the French principle of deliberately not collecting them because it's an inappropriate thing to do. It's an un-European thing to do.
But I think it's also like, it's a good sort of reassurance, I think, to those who are concerned about, for example, freedom of speech, that empowering the wider public with the tools they need through sort of media literacy, I think, is an important way of ensuring that they can not just be scrutinising what governments and others, online influencers are saying, but they can also be scrutinising what the fact checkers are saying. So I think that would put us in a much sort of healthier information environment than we have at the moment.
John, I don't know whether you know about Elizabeth's work at Demos.
I do. I know Elizabeth, actually. She was in Cambridge as a PhD student. Yeah, great work. Elizabeth is like incredibly good.
So what's she actually doing? So just tell us what she's doing.
Epistemic integrity kind of work, right, at Demos. Yeah. So it's like she, from my understanding, it's been a while since I've talked to her actually, but from my understanding, she approaches this kind of information integrity problem, if you will, not kind of like I was arguing earlier, not from the perspective of like we need to look at what's true and what's false, but rather how we make sense of information, right? So how, if there's so much of it, right, what are pathways to distilling it to a reasonable kind of worldview, if you will. Right? Either way, so I'll answer your question first, Julian. Yeah. So what do you get at its best if you invest funds optimally, I guess was the question, right? So I think, first of all, you need a very clear picture of like the strategies that are applied, right? Meaning there are ways to make money online, right, that are in a way not regulated in any meaningful sense, that we would nonetheless have a negative judgment of, right? If someone buys a bunch of bots to spread content about cryptocurrencies, people buy these cryptocurrencies, it becomes a rug pull, you sell it, that's a scam, right? But it isn't regulated as such in any meaningful way at the moment. Secondly, you have others jumping into this information space that have clear, like, whatever, financial or political goals in mind, right? Where we also have, like, well, actually, like, we're not so sure if you should be allowed to do this. So the argument that I want to make is what we need to zoom in on are these bottlenecks, right? We know that at the consumer level, if we focus on individual behavior and cognition, what we can achieve in terms of behavioral change and attitudinal updates and belief updating is small and fleeting, not useless at all, but small and fleeting. And from the production side, right, I joke from time to time that I email Vladimir Putin every once in a while, asking him, could you please cut it out, with the disinformation. We appreciate it greatly. He never responds to my emails, right? He doesn't really do that. So there's also like a supply side to this that cannot be meaningfully regulated. Right, so what we need is there's a pipeline from supply to consumer, right, from production to consumer, and that pipeline is not equally wide everywhere, right? So we need to find the narrowest point in this pipeline, and that's where we need to focus a good chunk of our efforts, I think. And my view is that this sits in the economic component, right? There are very few people making money off of these services that are provided online to sell influence operations and scams and so on and so on. Right, so finding them, identifying them, knowing how they work, who they are, how they can be reasoned with, or if they can't be, how they can be disincentivized, much like any other market, is a very, very sensible starting point for not only research, but also for intervention. With respect to the moral panic point, I actually kind of agree that misinformation as it has been conceptualized, or as it was conceptualized in 2016, as it kind of sprouted into a large kind of burgeoning field of research, policy intervention, et cetera, was kind of misconstrued a little bit, right? Which has also opened up the way for these arguments of saying, like, well, actually, what are we worried about? Because the volume of misinformation that we see online, on social media, is very low, which is true, right? It's just that that depends quite strongly on your definition of what that means, right? Like false news headlines are not common, right? Especially not from non-mainstream news outlets. What is very common is misleading content, right? And there is, again, a payoff to strategically misleading people, right? And so that means that threat actors jump into this space because they consider it to be beneficial to them to do so, right? And for that, I think, if we know that adversaries such as the Russian Federation are doing this deliberately and knowingly, looking for the weak points in our information ecosystems in order to achieve certain goals, which are getting us to stop funding the war in Ukraine, right? Electing politicians that are more amenable to the Russian Federation. Like, these are just strategic goals that they have for which they use the information space to achieve those goals. I think if it is true, which it is, that our adversaries have those goals and are using those tools that they have available, then we should see that as a thing that we should be concerned about, right? We don't need to panic. We don't need to run around with our hair on fire. Certainly not, right? But it is worth being appropriately concerned from that angle, in my point of view.
And Christine, do you want to pick up on Julian's point? And I'm particularly interested, we haven't sort of particularly addressed it, but just you mentioned the elections bill as a possible opportunity. Kevin did. But I'm very interested in whether you think any country has got sort of good electoral law to protect against, talked about sort of weaknesses, but there are also sort of weak time or critical times. And elections clearly are a weak time when you may have very different outcomes if you have quite a lot of disinformation being focused on that. Is there any country that you've seen that actually has a sort of optimal law to protect against the impact of disinformation in elections that we ought to be looking to as a model?
I don't know. That's the answer, because I don't look at election law, right? Okay. But there is some things to think about it that relates to your point, which I think are important. So, just to answer the gentleman's point about the human rights and the epistemic rights, I take your point, right? I do see that the danger with what I've talked about there is also that you push the problems down the road, down the can, right? And you say, oh, we're going to do a new legal regime and everything's going to be included in that in the future. I also know that human rights can be politically contentious, even as a concept in this country.
To dislike.
Exactly, right. A couple of interesting things in terms of what you said about election. When you talked about state funding as well, for some countries this is extremely difficult. You know, they say we don't trust the government, we don't trust our state. There are lots of other countries around the world where that would be the lack of independence, would discredit whatever anyone did. I would think that we would aim to have states we can trust, governments we trust, particularly in democratic states, working towards SDG 16 to build institutional capacity. But this is a cultural issue. You know, we are sort of in the middle of the road here in Britain. Scandinavian countries, they trust their governments tremendously. Other places, they don't, which takes us to Casey. And I take the point about Casey saying, well, there were certain things that were just suppressed here for a particular political or normative persuasion. In France, they will not gather information on ethnicity because of the faith of the French Jews during the Second World War. And they've said we're not going to do something where we gather information that could be misused. We are seeing similar debates now in the US regarding women's health and health data, particularly with the criminalization of abortion. So again, cultural, right? Last point on big things for Julian to do. Well, I have lots of ideas, but I'm not going to tell you here. But one of the things we haven't talked about, final words, we haven't talked about the initiative in Europe of the Eurostack, of trying to wrestle digital sovereignty and saying, okay, if we are digital sovereigns, we can also impose our laws in our jurisdictions to regulate. That is also a model. If they'll succeed is a different question, but there are still ideas here to explore.
Very interesting. Going to take a final round of very, very super quick questions. So we've got somebody oh, God, they've got lots of people. Can we do this all in? You've already have one. Yes. So let's ration.
It's not a super specific question, but more a talking point on monopolies of information, and so how Google has most of the search traffic going through it. Meta is on Instagram, Facebook, and WhatsApp throughout most of the Western world, the predominant social media that lots of people use. In a utopian world, there's the benefit of that cross-border information flow. You get diversity of thought. You can hear and see things from people all over the world talking about different things, but obviously that centralizes power in one place. So if you break that up, is there a chance of siloing information and thought and discussion between certain communities? I'm aware that happens anyway on these platforms, but what do you think about that in terms of a global platform, but the monopoly that then potentially brings?
Okay, and then we've got hand up behind, and then lady here, who I think
very much. Christian Riley-Smith. I'm running a discussion group on a similar topic, but I hope you can all come. For goodness sake, bring food. I don't want to be the only one eating. Question for the panel: have you given any thought to how you can measure harm associated with information disorder, whatever variety you want to play with?
Okay, and final question, lady there. Apologies to anyone who didn't get a question.
So you talked about the bottlenecks and sort of trying to take a slightly strategic approach to this super thorny problem. Is that also maybe a bottleneck in terms of or maybe not the opposite bottleneck, how urgent is it really in different ways? So is there a point at which we as, what's the critical point at which we stop being able to detect that something, Reddit's full of bots and you can tell that at the moment, and someone who's got some level of media literacy without that being super targeted and developed further, but we all in this room at some point will probably stop being able to tell what is and isn't? Or do you disagree with that and actually humans are really clever and we'll always be able to tell? So how do you sort of balance that sort of, let's not try and find a perfect solution because we've got to solve this crisis. This is similar with the climate crisis. You have that balance of actually we're at a real critical point now, so we've just got to throw everything at buying us another 5 years. And where do you sort of stand on that balance of priorities?
Okay, well, I'm going to get my very excellent panel to... David, do you want to word?
I'm just going to... David Cleveley, I just wanted to echo what, Rebecca, you've just said. Sam Altman wrote a rather interesting piece earlier this year called The Gentle Singularity. Isn't it game over? We should be skating to where... Wayne Grotsky says we should be skating to where the puck's going to be.
Okay, so we missed the boat. Let's do... Just if you could just sort of morph brilliantly into covering all of these issues, whether actually it's a plus or a minus that we have these monopolies to sort of know who they are and stuff like that. Does that help having a sort of common conversation, or is it very bad? And we've seen things about Google being sort of forced to divest its Chrome browser or whatever possibilities there. How do we actually have a common view of what harm is, and can we measure harm? So could we know if we were reducing harm? I suppose the question, is it all too late, and are we actually being misinformed all over the place in ways that we're not spotting as smartly as you on Reddit are spotting all these bots getting at you? And Christine, do you want to kick off with any or all of those in a magisterial synthesis?
Well, in a magisterial synthesis, as a lawyer, I would say for all of them, it depends. That is always the right lawyer answer. I'm not qualified to answer any of them, but say that my social scientist colleagues at Cambridge will have answers that are better informed.
Okay, so find a social scientist. John, I'll find a psychologist.
Speaking as a social scientist, okay, so with respect to harm at the individual level, we find lots. We've done however many hundreds of studies, not me personally, but my field, effectively, and other fields, into the impacts of information consumption on attitudes, beliefs, behaviors, and those are fairly clear. Meaning, people update their beliefs when faced with information, including misinformation, right? And that can be sustained over time and so on. And that translates under some context to behavior. The problem is that we have a tremendous problem translating that to the macro level, right? Which is a very irresponsible thing to do, right? Where we don't really find necessarily, or we don't even have good ways of measuring whether, for example, individual level exposure and belief in whatever kind of information translates to how you behave in the voting booth. We don't know that, and it's almost impossible to know. We have indications, in different contexts, we found, for example, a very good independent correlation, should not say causation, correlation between like a generalized test that measures how susceptible you are to believing misinformation and COVID-19 vaccine uptake in the United Kingdom, meaning at the postcode level. And that association holds very well when controlling for age, Brexit vote, political affiliation, a bunch of other control variables. That association holds independently, right? So there's tons of like indicators or shadows almost of this macro effect occurring, but right, that doesn't mean, and I wouldn't even want to begin to argue that that is why Brexit occurred. That is absurd to say, right? That wouldn't work that way. We do not have that evidence. So that's a very difficult transition where you have to be very, very responsible as a scientist, basically, to say, to have an appropriate assessment of what harm is at the macro level. At the micro level, we're fairly sure. With respect to bot detection, like the detectors that we have are terrible. Like there was one recent study from 2024 where the team that developed the best bot detector identified a bot network, right, but through a different method, not with their bot detection, but some other way, on Twitter in this case, and they then ran their own bot detector over that network to see, okay, can we detect them as bots? 4% accuracy, which is not very good. Does that mean it's over? Okay, so God bless him, Mr. Altman, he runs a company. He wants to make money running that company. One of the components of that, from my understanding, is that he is at the moment also engaging in some sort of political discussions with respect to how AI should be regulated, right? And the way that I kind of read his comments kind of over time is he's framing it as an existential risk. Therefore, the access to the production of these tools should be limited to an extent, right? And therefore, right, just let us do it, and maybe two others, right? That's a very, very cynical interpretation of Mr. Altman's words, right? But not fully inaccurate. In other words, are we really sure that there's a soft singularity or any kind of singularity happening? Not really. Like there's the dead internet theory stuff, right? Where like all of the internet is basically just bots and like it's just bots talking to one another and we're just kind of there being like, what's real and what's fake. I'm sort of a semi-believer in that idea in the think that there's much more bot content out there than we think there is. But I'm also not fully on board with the decline of kind of human interactions sort of being reduced to nothing, basically being ground to dust by the algorithms. I'm not a believer in that either, and I think here the only really appropriate attitude, at least from my perspective as a social scientist, to take is, well, okay, Mr. Altman is a clever guy, like he knows a thing or two about AI, but let's be careful not to take his words as gospel and also consider the externalities of that kind of line of argument, if that makes sense.
Final word, Kevin.
And really quickly on the Google question, I think whoever is sort of running this sort of monopoly or not, what we've been calling for is for example, content neutral interventions to make sure that authoritative sources of information feature higher in search and feed results. We'd love to see that. On the question of measuring harm, that's something that Full Fact does to sort of prioritise what we do fact check, being particularly concerned, for example, about the harm that could be done by health misinformation. Again, that's something that we've looked for to actually be incorporated into a strengthened Online Safety Act. And then this question of, is it game over? What a lovely question to conclude a session. Maybe we brought this on ourselves talking about epistemic chaos and all that. But what I would say is, Jill mentioned at the start of this session that Full Fact used to be based, I think, pretty much in the loft of the Institute for Government. And I've looked at some clips from those days in the previous election where we had loads of volunteers very diligently sifting through newspapers looking for misinformation. And now, as I said in my talk earlier, we have AI that is sifting through many, many thousands of words and helping us to identify claims that we can currently get rated and such like. So that gives me a lot of cause for optimism, actually, that if we, and all of us in the information environment, can work together, it's going to be far from game over.
And when I first worked with Full Fact, there were 6 of them in a very pokey office just off Holborn. So moving to the IFG loft was a big step up in the world and a big expansion of staff then. But it's really, really interesting how that's evolved. I'm not sure we've solved anything today, but I do think we've shed huge amounts of light on a lot of really, really difficult and tough questions for civil society, for charitable funders, for governments, for the supranations, I don't know, supranational governance and things like that, about what on earth we can do, and we'll have to hope that David is wrong and it's not game over. But anyway, it's game over for this panel, though. And so could you quickly thank my excellent panellists?